Our sprint goal was to display a simple calendar with some mock events, and also implement registration and login functionality. We're fairly confident that we achieved this goal and more. When choosing user stories for this sprint, we tried to relate them to our goal as much as possible. Therefore, the user stories we selected focus on registering, logging in, logging out, keeping the user signed in if they choose to, and viewing sessions on a calendar. We also selected developer stories that focus on a cloud-based database, as this is crucial for most functionality. The first story we're going to review is User Story 11, which was to implement a registration feature. Chris was the owner of this story. On the screen you can see when Chris started developing this feature and when it was moved to quality assurance. Liam completed the acceptance testing on the 26th of September and the story was moved to the done column. This story was unit tested, and the code for this can be found in the documentation section on Trello. The app demonstrations in this sprint review will prove that this story has passed its acceptance tests. User Story 2 focused on implementing the login feature, which was a key part of our sprint goal. Reese was the owner of this story, and the cards on the screen right now show the story's progression from the sprint backlog through to quality assurance. Reese completed the story on September 23rd, and it was acceptance tested by SAFe on the 26th. Additionally, this story was unit tested. The following screen recordings show this story passing its acceptance tests. User Story 1 was an extension of our sprint goal and is all about creating a better user experience. Its aim was to allow the user to choose whether they want the app to keep them logged in when they close it. Reese was also the owner of this story. Development started on September 21st, testing started on the 25th, and by the 26th, SAFe had completed the acceptance testing. As you'll see shortly, this story passed its acceptance tests. This next user story is the beginning of one of the most important features of our app. As the owner of this story, SAFe developed an interactive calendar that retrieves session information from a server. Development started on the 19th of September and testing began on the 25th. Reese completed the acceptance tests, which this story passed. This story was also unit tested. User Story 4 was to allow the app to log the user out. Reese was also the owner of this story, which he started developing on September 21st. It was tested by Liam and determined to be complete on the 26th. Here's a demo of this feature. This story was one of our developer stories, and its goal was to implement a database. Liam began developing this on the 18th of September, but didn't move the Trello card until the 23rd. On the 26th, the story was tested and completed. This database is the backbone of many other user stories. Here are some SQL table descriptions with some sample data to show how the database works. The final user story in this review is our second developer story. The task here was to implement a database in the cloud to allow for remote access. Liam was the owner of this story and began development on the 19th of September. It was moved to quality assurance on the 23rd and acceptance tested by Reese on the 26th. The PHP scripts developed to implement this story are used by almost all of the other user stories. The demonstrations in this review show our app interacting with the server, and the following files make up the completed story. Links to the database and the PHP web server have been added to the documentation section of Trello. This is our burn down chart, and our whole team agrees that this is not how we wanted it to look. Unit testing became a struggle for us, and we didn't understand how small a unit test really needs to be. Because of this, we spent a lot of time finding frameworks and testing features which shouldn't have been unit tested, such as the Android UI and the database. This is why our user stories weren't marked as done until right before the end of the sprint, and why the burn down chart doesn't reflect that we were working on these stories throughout the sprint. Although we did encounter some impediments, none of them stopped us from achieving our sprint goal. None of the user stories failed, and they were all completed. This has been shown throughout this review with our demonstrations. Another impediment which created unforeseen work was our original database provider. Liam set up a database account, created the tables, and had working scripts that communicated with our app. The database provider terminated the account, and the only way to reactivate it was to pay for the service. This meant we had to find a new provider, create the tables, and update the scripts, which was a big waste of time. Aside from a few small hiccups with getting used to the source control system, and some problems with the Android Studio emulator, we had no other significant impediments. None of them stopped us from achieving the sprint goal anyway, and we've all learned valuable lessons from this sprint that we can apply in the next one. Thank you for taking the time to watch our sprint review. We hope you've enjoyed and that you've learned a lot about our development process. We can't wait for you to see our progress in the next sprint.